Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and today I'm going to go over Chapter 2 and 3, which is mainly about kind of the educational experience. And this is really a disappointment for Scout because, for one thing, she already knows how to read because her dad taught her how. The teacher is not going to like this because she is learning this new educational way, and in her mind there's a wrong way to learn how to read if you've already mastered it by this age. So you sort of see Harper Lee's criticizing education, but Atticus does talk to Scout about it and says one of the important lines that's kind of the underlining theme in the entire book, which is to try to consider how she feels, to get inside her skin a little bit. Imagine you're from a different town and you're a new teacher and you're walking in and you have no earthly idea what you're doing, which most new teachers don't. And it's never what you think it's going to be. You can never anticipate what exactly the students are going to be like. And so it's completely different than what she's used to. And she also wants to try to establish herself as an authority figure that the students respect and so forth. But you'll see how that goes. So she's excited about going to school. But the rest of her peers, some of them have repeated the first grade many times and still have not learned how to read. These are mostly farmers. They don't spend the whole year in school because they might be needed in the field. And they just really don't have the mindset either. This is before you had television or anything else that was kind of giving you proper speech or letting you know what was going on in the world. All you really had was your parents. And so if your parents weren't educated and they didn't know how to read, you didn't pick up on those types of things. Atticus, of course, is a lawyer and is probably the most educated person in town. So, it's more natural that Scout does know how to read. And but she finds out very quick that she doesn't really fit in. It seems reasonable to just put her in a different grade, but they don't really think about that. So, at any rate, you also see the kids and what their economic situation is like. When they get in the classroom and she says, everyone who can go to town, which is what you walk to town to eat, you can go do that. And otherwise, if you brought your lunch, let me see it. And she looks around and she's a little bit like, oh, this is what these kids eat. She gets to Walter Cunningham. You saw very briefly his dad giving Atticus some potatoes because Mr. Cunningham got himself into a little bit of trouble, had to get a lawyer, couldn't pay Atticus back. And Atticus explains to Scout that this is what people do. Even Dr. Reynolds does it. He doesn't have actual money, but throughout the year he'll give him so many things that he grows that eventually he will pay him off. But the Cunninghams are very poor, and Miss Caroline isn't used to seeing this. Okay, so she comes in, and this was also during a time when children really should have been seen but not heard. So when you have a kid just kind of calling out and saying things, very normal today, but it wasn't okay then. That was considered bad manners. You didn't speak unless you were spoken to. And Scout doesn't really have a filter. She just kind of says whatever that comes to her mind. So I'm just going to read this part to you, and then we'll see what happens when Walter Cunningham goes home with Scout and Jim in order to eat lunch. Did you forget your lunch this morning? Asked Miss Caroline. Walter looked straight ahead. I saw a muscle jump in his skinny jaw. Did you forget your lunch this morning? Asked Miss Caroline. Walter's jaw twitched again. Yep, he finally mumbled. Miss Caroline went to her desk and opened her purse. Here's a quarter, she said to Walter. Go and eat downtown today. You can pay me back tomorrow. Walter shook his head. No, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, he drawled softly. Impatience crept into Miss Caroline's voice. Here, Walter, come get it. Walter shook his head again. When Walter shook his head a third time, someone whispered, Go on and tell her, Scout. I turned around and saw most of the town and the entire bus delegation looking at me. Miss Caroline and I had conferred twice already, and they were looking at me in the innocent assurance that familiarity breeds understanding. I rose graciously on Walter's behalf. Miss Caroline, what is it, Jean Louise? Miss Caroline, he's a Cunningham. I sat back down. What, Jean Louise? I thought I made things sufficiently clear. It was clear enough to the rest of us. Walter Cunningham was sitting there lying his head off. He didn't forget his lunch. He didn't have any. He had none today, nor would he have any tomorrow or the next day. He'd probably never seen 3 quarters together at the same time in his life. I tried again. Walter's one of the Cunninghams, Miss Caroline. I beg your pardon, Jean Louise? It's okay, ma'am. You'll get to know all the country folks after a while. The Cunninghams never took anything they can't pay back. No church baskets, no script stamps. They never took anything off anybody. They get along on what they have. They don't have much, but they get along on it. My special knowledge in the Cunningham tribe, one branch, is what I gained from the events last winter. And this is where she talks about how Walter's dad came and Atticus said, don't worry about it. You know, he's going to pay it off in his vegetables or whatever he has to give them. And so, but what happens is, this also kind of has a little bit of a conversation where Scout asks Atticus, are we poor? And Atticus says, no, we're not poor. But he also points out that, you know, he works for the town people. And if the people are poor, then that means that the doctors and the lawyers are poor too. Because, you know, you're getting paid in potatoes or something. So this is, you know, she's giving you a picture of not just saying this was during the Depression, but showing you these kids don't have shoes. If they did, they would wear them the first day and then discard them the rest of the year because they would need to save them. They don't want to wear them out. So at any rate, she says something to Miss Caroline. She says, you're shaming him, Miss Caroline. Walter hasn't got a quarter at home to bring you, and you can't use any stove wood. And this has been enough for her. She says, hold out your hand, and Scout holds out her hand. She has no idea what she's about to do, and she whips it with a ruler, which makes the class just die laughing once they realize what's happened. And she sends her to the corner, which of course Scout really didn't do anything wrong, and she's just not understanding why she's being treated this way. At any rate, so when she catches up with Walter Cunningham, she wants to fight him. Jim gets her off of him, and Jim feels sorry for him and says, hey, well, your dad knows my dad. Why don't you come and eat lunch with us? So then you see that he comes there. They talk a little bit about Boo Radley. He's still, you know, even Walter says, you know, I almost died. Put those pecans out there and I ate them. And you know he poisons them. And so this is something they talk about for a little bit and then they eat. And the kids are kind of surprised because Atticus can hold a conversation with Walter like Walter's a grown man. What Walter does know is a lot about farming. And so, of course, Atticus is very polite. He's going to talk to him in terms of what his company knows best. But then there's this awkward moment when they get their food and Walter pours syrup on his vegetables and meat. And Scout looks at him and says, what are you doing? I think she says, what the Sam Hill are you doing? When Walter says that he has, he says, the reason I can't finish the first grade, Mr. Finch, is because I have to stay out every spring and help Papa with the chopping. But there's another at the house, it's field size. Did you pay a bushel of potatoes for him? I asked, but Atticus shook his head at me. So she just really can't figure out, and all kids experience this. Like, what did I do? What did I say? Why is it okay for you to say it, but then when I repeat it at a certain time, it isn't? And this is just part of the growing up. You realize that the first chapter really is just about innocence. And then the second half of the book is about the loss of innocence. So there's a lot more that goes on the second half than, I won't discuss the first half as in detail as I will like the court scene. But this is to give you an idea of what it is to grow up and to just not really understand even that this would be embarrassing to Walter. Atticus knows that, Calpurnia knows that, but she doesn't get it. And that's part of the pains of growing up. So he pours syrup over his food. Scout makes a big deal about this. It embarrasses Walter. And then Calpurnia says she needs to come into the kitchen, and she tells Scout off. She says, there's some folks who don't eat like us, she whispered fiercely, but you ain't called to contradict them at the table when they don't. That boy's your company, and if he wants to eat up the tablecloth, you let him, you hear? He ain't company, Cal. He's a Cunningham. Shush your mouth, doesn't matter who they are. So, you see, there's even a bit of a class structure. Cunninghams are below the Finches. Of course, Calpurnia says, no, there's really no difference. He's your company, and you don't need to treat him that way. Of course, she doesn't know that she's treating him badly in the first place, but it's just those growing pains. So she gets mad at Calpurnia. She does something that I think we all do as kids and think, I'll go out in the river and drown one day, and then she'll be sorry. So she thinks about this until her imagination is broken with, "It's alive!" she screamed. But before I get to that, think about why Cunningham put syrup on his food. What does he eat every day? Probably squirrels, possum. It probably doesn't taste very good. So this is just out of habit. And he probably has never really had a good home meal like that, ever. So he doesn't know what to expect either. And he doesn't know what's proper. Anyway, so the male population of the class rushed to her assistance. Lord, I thought she's scared of a mouse. Little Chuck Little, whose patience with all living things was phenomenal, said, "Which way did he go, Miss Caroline? Tell us which way he went. D.C." He turned to the boy behind him. "D.C., shut the door and we'll catch him. Quick, ma'am. Where'd he go?" Miss Caroline pointed a shaking finger, not at the floor, but at the desk, but to a hulking individual unknown to me. Little Chuck's face contracted and said gently, "You mean him, ma'am?" "Yes'm, he's alive. Did he scare you in some way?" Miss Caroline said desperately, "I was just walking by when it crawled out of his hair. Just crawled out of his hair." Little Chuck grinned broadly. "There ain't no need to fear a cootie, ma'am. Ain't you ever seen one? Now don't you be afraid. You just go back to your desk and teach us some more." Little Chuck Little was another member of the population who didn't know where his next meal was coming from, but he was a born gentleman. He put his hand under her elbow and led Miss Caroline to the front of the room. "Now don't you fret, ma'am. There ain't no need to fear a cootie. I'll just go fetch you some cool water." The cootie's host showed not the faintest interest in the fur he brought. He searched his scalp above his forehead, located his guest, and pinched it between his thumb and forefinger. Miss Caroline watched the process in horrid fascination. Little Chuck brought the water in a cup. She drank it gratefully. Finally, she found her voice. "What is your name, son?" she asked softly. The boy blinked. "Who, me?" Miss Caroline nodded. "Burris Ewell." Miss Caroline inspected her roll book. "I have a Ewell here, but I don't see a first name. Would you spell your first name for me?" "Don't know how. They call me Burris at home." "Well, Burris," said Miss Caroline, "I think we'll have to excuse you for the rest of the afternoon. I want you to go home and wash your hair." She went to her desk. She goes through this volume, says, "Oh, here we go. Here's a home remedy for you, Burris. I want you to go home and wash your hair with Lyle soap. And when you've done that, treat your scalp with kerosene." "What for, missus?" "To get rid of the cooties. You see, Burris, the other kids might catch them, and you wouldn't want that, would you?" The boy stood up. He was the filthiest human being I've ever seen. His neck was dark gray, the blacks of his hands were rusty, and his fingernails were black deep into the quick. He peered at Miss Caroline from a fist-sized clean space on his face. No one had noticed him, probably because Miss Caroline and I had entertained the class most of the morning. "And Burris," said Miss Caroline, "please bathe yourself before you come back." The boy laughed rudely. "You ain't sending me home, missus. I was on the verge of leaving. I done my time this year." Miss Caroline looked puzzled. "What do you mean by that?" The boy did not answer. He gave a short, contemptuous snort. One of the elderly members of the class answered her. "He's one of the Ewells, ma'am." I wondered if this explanation would be as unsuccessful as my attempt, but Miss Caroline seemed willing to listen. "Whole school's full of 'em. They come the first day of the year and then they leave. The trunk lady gets them here because she threatens them with the sheriff. She's given up trying to hold them. She reckons she carries out the law by getting their names on the roll and running them here the first day. You're supposed to mark them absent the rest of the year." "But what about their parents?" asked Miss Caroline in genuine concern. "Ain't got no mother," was the answer, "and their pa's right contentious." Burris was flattered by the recital. "Been coming to first grade for 3 years now," he said expansively. "Reckon if I'm smart this year, they'll promote me to the second." Miss Caroline said, "Sit down, Burris," and the moment she said it, I knew she'd made a serious mistake. The boy's condescension flashed anger. "You try and make me, missus." Little Chuck Little got to his feet. "Let him go, ma'am," he said. "He's a mean one, a hard-down mean one, and liable to start something, and there's some little folks here." He was among the most diminutive of men, but when Burris Ewell turned toward him, Little Chuck's right hand went to his pocket. "Watch your step, Burris," he said. "I soon kill you as look at you. Now go home." Burris seemed afraid of a child half his height, and Miss Caroline took advantage. "Burris, go home. If you don't, I'll call the principal," she said. "I have to report this anyway." Safely out of range, she turned and shouted, "Report and be damned to ya. Ain't no snot no slut of a school teacher ever born making me do nothing. You ain't making me go nowhere, missus. You just remember that. You ain't making me go nowhere." He waited until he was sure she was crying and shuffled out the building. Soon they go back to her desk and they say, "He's a real mean one below the belt. You ain't called on to teach folks like that. Them ain't Makeham's ways, really. Why don't you go back to that cat thing? That was really good this morning." And so she blows her nose. She says, "Thank you, darlings," dispersed us, opened the book, and mystified the first grade with a long narrative about a toad frog who lived in a hall. Now, remember when she told the cat story, Scout makes a comment that they've never heard of a cat like talking and as a character, as an animation. So they're taking the story quite literally, not figuratively, as we would see it. They're wondering, like, how on earth did this happen? Kind of reminds me of when I taught Modest Proposal, where Jonathan Swift proposes as an answer to the Irish phantom that we just eat children. We could roast them, we could cook it up, and of course it's great pains to try to convince 12th graders even at this time that he's being facetious, but this is satire. He's not really proposing that they eat kids, but they just couldn't get it out of their heads because they were taking it literally. And this is a big difference in the way you read literature, you know. It's not just about a plot. That doesn't really matter. What matters is what comes out of it thematically, because that's what you're going to write about. That's what you're going to talk about. So, you know, and what's important here is to see education, because these same people who have been educated in the same system are going to end up as jurors. So when it really comes to important things like voting or being a juror, education does matter. Being able to think critically does matter. Being able to listen to someone and being able to say whether or not you think they're credible in some way. So, and another point I think about this little scene is that Burris Ewell is the younger brother of Mayella Ewell. And Mayella Ewell is going to be the one who accuses Tom Robinson of rape. So you get a little bit of the family background, and when she talks to her father about it, you know, and she says, I don't want to go to school anymore, and guess what? You don't have to, because they don't do it. The Ewells don't do it. And he says, but you're not a Ewell. Well, what's the difference? You know, and he points out that the Ewells also are able to hunt out of season. And she says, well, that's against the law. And he says, yeah, it is. But would you rather have the kids starve when you don't have a mother and your father is a drunkard and doesn't care about the children? Why would you care about a hunting law? And so what the important thing by that scene is to show even the law isn't always black and white, that there are some exceptions to the rules, because society is full of exceptions of when you're dealing with human beings. You know, it's not a perfect science. So you can't set one condition and just say everybody should follow this, because it doesn't really work in society. And you also just see through this scene, I wish they would do this scene in a movie. I know they have to pick and choose. Whenever you watch the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, you know, you should really watch it after you're done with the book, because you're going to be amazed at how many things are not there. But, you know, a book is much longer and a movie is about 2 hours. You only have about 100 pages of script, and most of that's description that gets to be made. And so you have to choose your scenes very carefully. And that's why it matters. You can't just watch the movie. There's a lot you're going to not understand in terms of context. Even though it seems like this first whole part one is mainly just building up these kids' lives and environment before she gets to what really matters and what really disrupts this town. So that was actually 2 and 3. So I will stop there, and then next time I'll talk about chapters 4 and 5. All right, thanks.